The night everything changed began like every other performance at Ashbourne Hall, polished silver, staged smiles, and the gentle hum of people applauding the life someone else had written. But when my father Gregory Hale raised his glass and decided to turn a private spite into public theater, he pulled back a curtain that exposed more than my lineage. It exposed the fragile blueprint of his power. What followed was a quiet kind of violence, not fists, but documents, not shouting, but a single deliberate tear. By the time the chandeliers stopped trembling, something in that house had been irrevocably altered. Before I tell you my complete story, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling me one moment you chose dignity over acceptance. It happened on my father's 65th birthday, inside Ashbourne Hall, the kind of place built to showcase one man's accomplishments. The oak-paneled walls bore portraits of Gregory Hale at every stage of conquest, shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at building openings, standing proud with my siblings in staged family pictures. Not once in those frames did the camera treat me like an heir. I grew up invisible in someone else's gallery. My name is Adrian Hale. For the record, I was not born under that name in the same bed as Gregory and Isabel. I was adopted when I was 3. That fact, in Gregory's world, was never neutral. It was a brand he rubbed into conversations, a topic he sharpened into a barb and flicked at me when guests were present and cameras weren't. Lucas, 2 years younger, all Gregory's jawline and bravado, and Vivian, 3 years my senior, hereditary charm clipped to perfection, absorbed the spotlight Gregory threw. I learned to stand at the edges, a patient actor waiting for my cue to be small. Isabel, my mother in every measure that counted, was the only person who treated me otherwise. She braided my hair when I was small, bandaged scraped knees with a deliberate tenderness, and whispered into my ear, "We chose you. You are ours." Those words kept me steady through childhood dinners that felt like rehearsals where I was always the understudy. Still, nothing prepared me for the way Gregory would make spectacle of my status in a room full of people who had come to celebrate him. When the invitation came, it arrived like an edict. Ashbourne Hall, 8 o'clock, formal attire. I almost ignored it. But a phone call from Isabel pulled me back. "Adrian, please," she said softly. "For me. Sit with me for a moment." I promised her. I promised to be the son she wanted by her side, even if I would have to swallow a lifetime of diminishing glances. Ashbourne was more museum than home that evening. Crystal chandeliers reflected polite smiles into polished marble. Waitstaff moved like clockwork, and the band's piano underscored laughter. Guests, family friends, colleagues of Gregory's, and the sort of distant relatives who show up when champagne is promised, filled the halls. I arrived early, not to stake claim but because Isabel asked me to, and I wanted to be where she would need my comfort. She met me in the foyer. She smelled of lavender and something older, like lemon oil and daybreak. "You look well," she said, adjusting my cuff. Her hands trembled the slightest when she touched me. Behind her, Gregory was the sun at the room center. His laugh flashed through the crowd and found its way into every corner. Lucas stood close, chest broad, soaking up warmth by proximity. Vivian floated at his side, luminous and practiced in her grace. I had a small envelope in my jacket pocket. It was not ostentatious, no bow, no fanfare. It was a deed, signed and notarized months earlier, transferring the ownership of a modest commercial property I had developed into a downtown block into Gregory's name. Not because I loved him in the way people in his orbit expected, but because there was a part of me that had wanted to offer him something that said, I tried. For years I had tried to be filial on my own terms. This was meant to be a finishing bow, a private olive branch wrapped in paper. Dinner passed with the usual tributes. Plates were cleared, the band softened. Gregory rose, glass in hand, and spoke with that practiced cadence that always made strangers nod in agreement. He told the stories of his early years, how he had scraped, fought, and clawed his way to a legacy. The room obliged with polite laughter at the right intervals. His friends nodded as if each sentence created a new notch in the life he sold to them. And then he shifted tone. He leaned forward a fraction, smiled in the way of a man about to drop a bomb, and said, "What is a legacy without blood to carry it?" Heads nodded, a few voices agreed softly. He looked directly at me, the hunting light in his eyes. "I have decided, for the sake of clarity," he announced, "that my adopted son, Adrian, will not share in what I leave behind." Laughter swelled, cruel, unfiltered. Lucas slapped his knee and guffawed. Vivian's smile was a cut on porcelain. Isabel's hand found mine and squeezed, but she remained silent, as she always had in his storms. It wasn't shame that rose in me, shame would have been to let their noise define me. It was a cold, burning certainty that they had no idea what I was willing to do. I rose, sliding my chair back so the wood scraped faintly against the stone. There are moments that require action rather than words, and that night I decided to act. I walked to the long table where gifts were displayed. People watched, curiosity replacing entertainment as the room quieted under the unusual rhythm of my steps. The envelope in my pocket was surprisingly heavy with consequence. I set it on the table, unfolded the flap, and then, with a calmness that startled me more than anyone else, I tore it down the middle, then across, and across again until the paper lay ragged and small in front of me. For a beat there was only the rustle of scraps. Gregory's face tightened. He barked, "What is that? What have you done?" His voice lacked its usual command. I met his eyes. "That," I said, letting each syllable settle into the hush, "was my gift to you. I intended to transfer to you something that had cost me, a property I developed. But you made your choice to erase me publicly. So I made mine." I allowed the statement to hang there. Curiosity rippled through the guests like wind. People began to murmur, shuffled conspiratorially, and leaned in. "What was in it?" someone whispered. Lucas's bravado ebbed. He barked something about theatrics, but his voice trembled. Vivian frowned, her composure fracturing at the edges. Gregory, color draining from his face, lunged to collect the pieces, hands trembling. He barked orders for napkins and tape, and for a moment the man who had cut a wide path through life was reduced to a frantic stranger trying to glue authority back together. As they scrambled, as napkins and tape tried and failed, the torn scraps revealed a typed, notarized header in black ink, a deed transfer. The name of a downtown building, the legal seals, signatures, all the weight of money and consequence printed plainly, the very thing Gregory had expected to present to his circle at some future date. The room shifted. Laughter dissolved into a low, growing hum of disbelief. I stepped forward. "You wanted everyone to see what you could take away," I said softly. "You wanted to announce that your legacy cannot include me because of bloodlines. So I took back what I had offered. That building was yours. I signed it to you, but I revoked it when you tried to revoke me." The words landed like an accounting ledger being balanced publicly. Gregory's hands shook as he tried to press the fragments together, failing to make whole from ragged edges what had been legally transferred only weeks prior. The room had changed its shape around us. What was once an audience had become a jury. For a long minute nobody spoke. Then whispers swelled into a tide, phones were raised, cameras fumbled out of pockets, and the careful choreography of Gregory's party dissolved into chaotic curiosity. I could feel the shift in the air. The same people who had come to honor his image were now watching that image crack. Gregory's face went through colors as if the room were a lamp and he a lampshade. Pride. Confusion. Rage. Fear. He abandoned the pretense of composure and barked at Lucas to call the lawyer, to fetch original documents, to bring the safe key. Lucas scrambled, his posture suddenly less sure. Vivian's smile was brittle as she pulled at the hem of her gown. Business partners, men I recognized from headlines and chamber dinners, exchanged looks, the kind that telegraphed recalculation. One of them opened his mouth, then closed it, his admiration evaporating into something cautious and small. "Tell them," Gregory hissed at me. "Tell them it's staged." I did not answer. There was no benefit in inventing explanations for people who had been thrilled to laugh just minutes earlier. Instead I let silence do the work that words often fail to do. When he lunged to collect the taped pieces, hands shaking, the room watched not a man but a spectacle of collapse. It was strange and terrible to see someone so accustomed to being unassailable become so human. Isabel rose slowly from her seat. She walked around the table and stood beside me. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce in that quiet way only those who have loved long and deeply can be. She did not look at Gregory, she looked into my face with an expression that said everything her voice could not. Her hand found mine under the table and squeezed. For the first time that night the warmth of belonging I had always suspected was possible settled on me like a cloak. Meanwhile the guests did what guests do at the scene of scandal, they picked sides or they picked exits. A few left quietly, unwilling to be involved in what they thought might become a sordid family dispute. Others stayed, transfixed. Someone whispered that a reporter from a local paper had been invited to cover the celebration. The rumor spread. If it was true, the story would not end with a hushed room and a few embarrassed apologies. It would go public, morning after morning, as scandal and spectacle. After the formalities, after napkins had been shoved into hands and servers tried to recompose the buffet into the evening's plan, Gregory excused himself, the word coming out like a plea. He retreated to his study with Victor and one of his senior partners. They closed the door and for a long silence the house seemed to hold its breath in the spaces they left behind. The band resumed, playing two songs that died halfway through as more guests stood and drifted toward the exits, sleepwalking out of the house as if nothing about the last hour had been the same. I walked out into the foyer and found the night outside waiting like an accomplice. Cool air lifted the smell of my father's cologne away from my clothes. The estate's drive was slick from a quick rain earlier in the day, and the lights cast the hedges into serrated silhouettes. Isabel caught up with me, her footsteps quick on the stone. She stopped beneath the portico and wrapped her arms around me, and for a moment we were two people far from the banquet, from the legacy, from the expectations that had trapped us in familiar roles for decades. "You did what you needed to," she whispered. "You showed them you're not their shadow." Her voice wavered with relief and something that might have been pride. "I'm sorry it had to be tonight." "Me too," I said. "But I couldn't be small again." She stayed with me long enough to press a warm loaf into my hands, one of the things she always did when she came to my apartment, a small ritual when we were alone and the world outside was sharp. "Keep it," she said, "and call me tomorrow." Then she walked back inside, a fragile figure returning to the house that had been both her crown and her cage. That night the fallout began. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with phone calls that started as quiet apologies and ended as careful alliances. A cousin I had not spoken to in years called on the pretense of concern for Gregory's health, but the guilt in his voice was loud. A few business acquaintances reached out privately, their messages measured and cautious. They praised my integrity without commenting directly on the legality of the deed, as if politeness could paper over the rupture in Gregory's life. Victor's reaction was more visceral and immediate. The following morning his office called me with thinly veiled threats, accusations of staging, of trying to ruin the family reputation, and an insistence that what I had done was spiteful. He said things he had never said as a child in the privacy of rooms, ugly, entitled things about inheritance and bloodlines. I listened without raising my voice. He could yell, he could posture, he could threaten lawsuits. None of that unmade what had happened. Within a few days a polite but unmistakable pattern emerged. Gregory withdrew. He stopped going to board meetings. He stopped attending the civic events that had once featured him on stage. People who had once sought his company found excuses, their voices in the small hours telling mutual stories of embarrassment. The empire he had built, which relied heavily on perception and personal authority, wavered when the perception shifted. There were other, quieter returns too. A woman from the accounting department at one of my smaller companies called. "We read about last night," she said, voice low. "If you need support with your papers or anything," she stumbled, as if she worried the offer would be misinterpreted. I thanked her, and she hung up with a small, relieved laugh. Those calls meant more than any applause from a room of strangers. They were the first hints of the chosen family I had cultivated through work and shared values, people who treated others as they wished to be treated and who didn't need to triangulate their worth through lineage. Isabel came by the next week with that same basket of bread, and this time we sat at my small kitchen table and spoke without timekeepers. She told me things I had suspected but never heard, the nights Gregory had come home seamier and crueler than what the portrait suggested, the ways he had learned to weaponize language, the moments she had swallowed herself to keep the peace. Her admission was not bitterness as much as a lament. She had loved him once, she said, in a way that made her keep silent. Now silence was no longer an option. "You changed him, Adrian," she said, not as accusation, but as observation. "You stopped being his patient audience. He's small because he measured himself by what other people thought of him. You exposed that measure was thin." That exposure, however, came with cost. 2 weeks after the party I received a formal letter through my lawyer. It was curt and contained legal language thin with civility. Gregory's counsel alleged fraud, claiming that title transfers had been altered and that there were irregularities with the deed documentation. The letter insisted on immediate reconciliation and demanded negotiation to avoid public litigation. If polite threats had a scent, that letter smelled of someone who still believed money and law could stitch authority back together. I read the letter at my kitchen table, the loaf of Isabel's bread perched on a cutting board between us like a witness. I called my own attorney, instructing him to respond with a calm, carefully constructed refusal to be bullied. The private lawyer conversations that followed were clinical, full of phrases like constructive transfer, recording status, and possession. The legal world, I realized, was another stage, one with its own choreography and its own sense of theater. Victor ramped up his own efforts in private. He tried to pressure mutual contacts to sever business ties with me, suggesting that my actions were reckless and unpredictable. A small client, one that had been considering a joint project with my company, paused negotiations. For a moment the past felt like a current pulling at my legs, tempting me to believe that all I had done was sabotage myself. But there were unexpected allies. A former mentor, a woman who had once taught me negotiation tactics in business school, contacted me with a practical offer: "If they go legal, I'll help you prepare." Another old colleague quietly introduced me to a real estate attorney who specialized in title disputes. These were not people who would attend Gregory's galas, they were practitioners who believed in fairness and in the quiet dignity of doing the right thing. And then, in the middle of that swirl, something else happened. A local reporter, who had been at the party, published a piece that didn't sensationalize the gossip as much as it asked questions: who owns what, how transfers were handled, and why a son would publicly revoke a gift meant to symbolize reconciliation. The piece was careful, it didn't betray my privacy. It simply asked the right questions in the right places. The story drew attention not as a tabloid scandal but as a human interest narrative about family, legacy, and the strange calculus of power. People who had only known the polished facade of Ashbourne Hall now saw a more complicated portrait. That public attention did two things: it pressured Gregory and his circle to reckon with optics they had previously controlled, and it gave my growing network courage to be more explicit in their support. "You did what no one else could," my mentor told me. "Now let the facts speak." As the legal letters accumulated and as private conversations transformed into formal meetings, I realized the contest I had started was not only about a single building or a single night. It was about the kind of life I wanted to live and the kind of legacy I would leave for myself and others. The deed, the dinner, the shattered envelope, they had become symbols in a larger story about dignity and choice. Part 2 closes with a notice that changes everything. A court summons arrived, crisp and official, asking me to appear in a hearing where Gregory sought to freeze any claims and to establish immediate control over the disputed property. The envelope felt heavier this time when I opened it, full of dates and deadlines and the tacit knowledge that the next chapter would require more than a public spectacle. It would require endurance, counsel, and the slow work of proving that dignity can be enforced as well as declared. The court summons felt like an echo of the night at Ashbourne Hall, crisp paper carrying the weight of Gregory Hale's will. Not his legal will, but the will that had always mattered more to him: the need to win. He had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, shaping people, manipulating truth. A courtroom was simply his next arena, or so he believed. But the court wasn't his stage. It didn't bow to him. It didn't fear him. The hearing date was set for 3 weeks later. During those 3 weeks, the cracks in the Hale family widened in ways none of them had expected. 2 days after the summons, a black Mercedes rolled up outside my building. I watched from my window as Gregory stepped out with Lucas supporting him. He looked smaller, drained, the arrogance stripped away by sleepless nights and a reputation bleeding from the edges. He waited by the curb, too proud to ring the bell. Lucas called me. "Dad wants to talk," he muttered. I came out. Gregory didn't look at me at first. His eyes stayed on the ground as though he was searching for the pieces of his dignity scattered across that birthday party. When he spoke, his voice trembled. "You humiliated me. You did that to yourself," I answered. His face twitched. "Withdraw your claim. Give the building back. My lawyers can fix the paperwork. We can make all of this disappear." It was always his strategy: rewrite reality, silence the truth, keep control. "No," I said calmly. Lucas bristled. "You're doing this to punish him. To punish us. If the truth feels like punishment," I said, "you should ask yourself why." Gregory finally lifted his head. His eyes were tired, red. "This will ruin me." "You ruined yourself the moment you decided to erase me in public," I replied. He opened his mouth, shut it, then whispered, "You'll regret this." But his voice no longer carried weight. It sounded like a man trying to threaten the wind. Vivian sent a message soon after: "You made your point. Stay away from this family." Lucas never sent messages, only increasingly furious voicemails about inheritance, blood, and how I had stolen his future. He had never once considered earning anything. While they raged, distant relatives maneuvered quietly. Some avoided me. Others reached out in hushed tones, offering support they didn't have the courage to show at the party. My attorney, Ms. Brenner, met me in her office with a folder she slid across the table. Inside were documents revealing Gregory had contested other transfer deeds in the past, 3 separate incidents involving business partners and even a charity. "He doesn't believe anything given away is truly gone," she said. "He believes it's still his. A pattern of control. One the court would care about." The day of the hearing arrived with a quiet buzz in the courthouse. Gregory entered with Lucas at his side, his suit too loose, eyes hollow. Vivian didn't show up, perhaps her perfect image couldn't withstand the scandal. Isabel came alone, her steps gentle but purposeful, and she gave me a small, steady nod when she saw me. Inside, Gregory's attorney argued that I had staged everything, that I never intended to gift the building. My attorney countered calmly, laying out the original deed, the notarization, the timeline. "The only person who destroyed the gift was Mr. Hale," she said. "He disowned his son publicly in front of dozens of witnesses. We have 36 statements." Color drained from Gregory's face. People who had laughed with him that night had now written statements against him. The judge leaned forward, studying both sides, then said, "This is not an inheritance dispute. It is a property case. The deed was valid. It remains valid. Mr. Hale, your request to reclaim or freeze the asset is denied. Gregory's hands shook as he braced himself on the table. Lucas muttered angrily. For the first time in his life, Gregory Hale stood in a room where his influence meant nothing. As we exited, reporters surged toward us with microphones and flashing lights. Gregory pushed past them, shoulders hunched, refusing to speak. Isabel approached me slowly, eyes shining with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For staying silent all those years. For letting him treat you the way he did." "You don't owe me an apology," I said gently. She shook her head. "I do. A mother is supposed to protect her child. I only protected peace." Her voice cracked and she cried quietly into my shoulder. That night, Lucas sent one last message: "Dad's losing it. He fired 3 employees today. He's threatening to dismantle part of the company. You did this." I didn't reply. Because it wasn't true. I hadn't broken Gregory Hale. He'd broken himself long ago. 3 days later, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, Gregory stood there alone, trembling. His suit was wrinkled, his tie undone, his eyes red. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like a giant. He looked like a man who had finally met his own truth. He swallowed hard, then spoke in a fragile voice I had never heard him use. "I'm sorry." The 2 words hung in the air between us, words he had never said to anyone. I didn't forgive him. Not then. But I listened. For the first time, Gregory Hale wasn't asking for obedience, or control, or respect. He was asking to be human. And that was the beginning of the end. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Gregory stood in my doorway like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether he wanted to fall or be pulled back. His clothes hung awkwardly, as though his body had shrunk faster than his pride could adjust to. The man who once commanded boardrooms with a single raised brow now struggled to hold his own weight. "I'm sorry," he repeated softly. "I should not have done what I did. Not that night. Not all those years." It wasn't an apology wrapped in eloquence or dignity. It was broken, uneven, and rough around the edges. But real. It was the first time I heard him speak without performance. "Why now?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because, the world isn't letting me pretend anymore." Gregory Hale had always been an architect of perception. He built himself out of accomplishments and applause, stacking achievements like bricks around his insecurities. When those bricks fell, when the illusion cracked, the man inside was suddenly exposed. "I spent my life thinking strength meant control," he said, staring down at his hands. "But when you tore that envelope, something in me tore too. And I realized I had nothing left except the people I pushed away." His voice shook. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "Not like this." For a moment, I saw not the tyrant who humiliated me, not the man who sharpened my adoption into a weapon. I saw a father who finally understood what damage he had caused. Someone who carried regrets heavier than any property deed. But regret doesn't rebuild a childhood. Regret doesn't erase scars. I stepped aside, letting him into my apartment. He walked slowly, as though he feared the floor might reject him too. He sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped, hands clasped like a penitent man. "Lucas blames me," he said. "Vivian barely speaks to me unless it's about the company. And Isabel, she told me she's tired. She said she's been tired for years." His voice trembled again. "I did that. All of it." He looked at me then, not with authority or command, but with the quiet desperation of someone who wanted a chance to be better. "I want to fix things," he said. "Tell me how." The truth is, I didn't know how. You cannot rebuild a house while it's still on fire. And Gregory's house, the one built from ego, fear, and legacy, was burning from the inside out. "You start," I said gently, "by accepting that not everything can be fixed." He bowed his head. "And you start by being a human being, not a king," I added. "If you keep trying to win, you'll lose everyone." He nodded slowly, the weight of it settling in his shoulders. We talked for hours. Not as father and son, not yet, but as 2 people trying to understand each other after decades of silence. He confessed to insecurities I never imagined. He spoke about his own father, a man even colder than he had been. He spoke about being terrified of losing power. Terrified of appearing weak. Terrified of being forgotten. Fear had shaped him far more than cruelty had. When he finally stood to leave, his voice was quiet. "Thank you for listening," he said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I want to try." "I know," I said. He turned to go, paused in the doorway, and added, "You deserved better than the man I was." Then he left. In the weeks that followed, things didn't magically transform. Pain doesn't evaporate just because truth has finally been spoken. But something did shift. Gregory stopped fighting in court. He instructed his lawyers to drop all actions against me. For the first time in his life, he surrendered willingly. Lucas visited once, mostly to shout, blame, and storm out again. He wasn't ready to let go of the future he thought he was owed. Vivian remained distant, unable to process her father's downfall or the shift in family dynamics. But Isabel, she blossomed. Without Gregory's shadow looming as heavily, she smiled more. Spoke more. One afternoon she told me, with soft triumph, "I told your father I won't tolerate any more cruelty in this house." And he listened. Ashbourne Hall slowly became less of a fortress and more of a place where real conversations began. Not perfect ones, but honest ones. And Gregory tried. Imperfectly. Awkwardly. But he tried. Some days he'd call just to ask how I was. Other days he'd ask me about my work, not to brag on my behalf, but simply to learn who I was outside his expectations. He never asked for the building again. He never mentioned the deed. And in the quietest, most unexpected way, he began to change. The night everything had fallen apart at his party, he had lost control of his narrative. But in losing that control, he found a sliver of humility he had never known. Months later, on a warm evening, Isabel invited me for dinner. Gregory cooked, a sight I thought I would never witness. He burned half the meal, dropping utensils and cursing under his breath, but he tried. When he set the plates on the table, he looked at me with hesitant hope. It wasn't perfect. But for the first time in my life, it felt real. And I realized something important: forgiveness isn't an obligation. It isn't owed. It isn't even always possible. But healing can begin simply by refusing to continue the cycle. I didn't forgive Gregory that night. But I let myself start healing. I let myself move forward. I let myself choose peace over resentment. Because I finally understood that even when someone tries to erase you, you can write your own script. You can build your own legacy. You can choose your own family, whether by blood or by bond. And in choosing myself, I had already won. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made you feel seen, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and comment below. Tell me what family means to you, or a moment you chose your own worth over someone else's cruelty. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me keep telling stories that matter.